To my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, let's be honest with immigrants who deserve better than what you're offering them. Don't welcome immigrants if you plan to reject them. If you keep pushing your bigoted H.R. 2 bill, then also pass this bill. I've taken the liberty of drafting it for you. It removes the Statue of Liberty, our largest symbol that tells people to come here. This is who you are, removing the fabric of America. So I want to know which Republican who supports and voted for H.R. 2 will introduce this bill. If you're going to support H.R. 2 and these bigoted measures, the least you can do is not be a damn liar.
It's amazing to me that just in a few years' time, it's now considered misinformation to talk about the Nazis in Ukraine. This is an extremely concerning situation. I don't think anyone in the United States government, Americans, do not support actual Nazis or white supremacists. I know I certainly do not. And I can't understand why in just a short amount of time, this information that our own American media frequently talked about is no longer talked about.
Before I get into it, it's interesting to hear my colleague just now talk about disavowing white supremacists when in 2022, she spoke at an event led by white supremacist and white nationalist Nick Fuentes, and when asked about it, doubled down on it and said, we're gonna focus on people, not labels. So get out of here with that damn hypocrisy. And Dr. Snyder, I'm gonna give you some time to respond.
First of all, I'd like to thank the representative from Georgia by making clear with her comments and with her person that any discussion of political warfare has to include Russia, Ukraine, and America. She's just demonstrated that point, I think, very powerfully.
Collectively, American undocumented immigrants pay an estimated $11.64 billion in state and local taxes every single year. And the average undocumented immigrant has been living and contributing to the economic success of our country for between 10 and 14 years. These are folks who are literally putting more into our system than they're taking out because they're undocumented. These are our friends, our family, teachers, substitute teachers, people who work in the medical field, people who work in hospitality, our neighbors. My family. Mr. Beer, how might white supremacist falsehoods about an invasion put immigrant communities in danger?
Look, we've talked about this before. We've seen the El Paso shooter manifesto, the Buffalo shooter. You go to Charlottesville, you saw what happened there. The Pittsburgh synagogue shooter. I mean, the number of crimes where now dozens of people have been murdered, it's astounding. They are saying what's motivating them. It's this idea that these people are invaders and therefore they can be responded to with military-style force.
Yeah, and it just makes me wonder because we keep hearing from colleagues on the other side, some of these witnesses, that I guess the rate doesn't matter or the data doesn't matter. And what really matters are the families and the victims, which I 100% agree with, but then they completely disregard the families and victims of immigrant communities because of the hateful rhetoric that they are pushing. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Since the beginning of his campaign for president, Donald Trump in 2015 has been consistently propagating hateful extremist rhetoric about immigrants, including falsehoods depicting all Mexican immigrants as criminals, as drug dealers, and as rapists. At campaign events just last month, Trump claimed that immigrants are poisoning the blood of this country. The Republican witnesses here today are the latest in a line of people spreading racist, far-right fiction in an attempt to dehumanize immigrants. Mr. Beer, I want to get back to some truth in this conversation. Is someone more likely to commit a crime if they are born in the United States or if they are foreign-born?
If they are born in the United States.
And you wrote in a Time article that I have right here, quote, no matter how researchers slice the data, through the numbers show that immigrants commit fewer crimes than native-born Americans. But that's not good enough for Trump followers. They firmly believe that immigrants make America less safe. What the anti-immigration crowd needs to understand is that not only are immigrants less likely to commit crimes than native-born Americans, but they also protect us from crime in several ways, end quote. And you're 100% right in that. Several studies show that immigrants are 46% less likely to commit a crime, and that in communities that have had an influx of undocumented immigrants, crime actually goes down. What about the friends and families of victims who have been murdered in schools across this country because my colleagues refuse to do anything to end gun violence? Does that matter? I guess not. We've already seen how this hateful anti-immigrant rhetoric has been taken up by bad actors to justify horrific violence against everyday Americans. And for example, when a gunman walked into a Walmart store, killing 23 people and injuring another 22. Almost exactly a year ago, Oversight Committee Democrats called on Chairman Comer and every Oversight Republican to condemn this rhetoric. Mr. Chair, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter dated March 6, 2023 from Ranking Member Raskin to Chairman Comer, yet again inviting you to condemn white nationalism and white supremacy in all forms, including the Great Replacement theory. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, since Republican politicians have no plan to address the real issues of this country, low wages, high prices, etc., their leaders at the highest levels have dipped into the fascist playbook to blame communities and to blame minorities and to blame immigrants for the issues that Americans are facing. And these days, the more fear you can stoke, the better. I mean, one of my colleagues, Marjorie Taylor Greene, has called immigrants terrorists. And many on the right take their cues from their top leader, former President Donald Trump. From 2015 to just this past Monday night in Iowa, he has used fear and racism to spread false narratives. He said that immigrants are, quote, poisoning the blood of our country, end quote, echoing the same language used by Hitler to describe Jewish people. Mr. Beer, why is it grossly incorrect to paint immigrants as criminals, and why is this rhetoric not only false, but dangerous?
Look, U.S. Census Bureau data is quite clear. Immigrants are about half as likely to be incarcerated in the United States as others. If you look at the illegal immigrant population as we have at the Cato Institute, it's, again, it's about 30% less. And that includes all the people that we're putting in cages just because they're immigrants. So it's not true that they're more likely to end up in our criminal justice system, burdening our courts and our police. And also, if you look at area studies that look at what happens to crime rates when an infusion of immigrants comes in, we've seen during the 1990s, especially when you had this huge wave, far exceeding anything that's happened recently, of immigrants come into major cities, there was this rebirth in the economy in those areas. They started businesses, they rejuvenated the communities, filled vacant housing, and that brought crime rates down as well. So there are multiple mechanisms by which immigrants reduce crime and make for a more secure community.
Of course, thank you. Mr. Beer, are you familiar with stochastic terrorism? Stochastic terrorism is to provoke random acts of ideological motivated violence that are statistically predictable. Last year, a gunman murdered 23 people and injured another 22 in El Paso, Texas, using the same rhetoric of invasion and the Great Replacement theory that we hear from Donald Trump and many leaders on the right. Mr. Beer, what's the point of stoking this type of hate towards immigrants?
Look, there's only two reasons why you use the word invasion. The first is you want to justify violence against them. Otherwise, you'd say it's a violation of the law, it's illegal, you want a law enforcement response. Invasion calls for a military violent response to these people. The second reason is to invoke invasion under the constitutional clauses in which that is used. There's two. One, states can respond to an invasion unilaterally. We know what an invasion under the Constitution means. James Madison said an invasion is an act of war. So we know what a real invasion is. We know the difference between people coming to serve us and work for us versus an act of war.
So this language fuels a lot of these hateful, violent acts we've seen.
Oh, absolutely.
So I just hosted a roundtable in my district because my constituents are terrified about the talk that's going on up here. An amazing community leader and pastor, Father Jose, brought up a really good point that migrants don't just want to come here. We told them to come here. And Mr. Beer, the Statue of Liberty, situated next to Ellis Island, an iconic American symbol, reads, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tepid toss to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Thank you so much, Dr. Snyder. And, you know, this hearing was put together to talk about political warfare, and it's strange because a lot of my Republican colleagues seem to be pointing a lot of fingers, but not at Vladimir Putin and not holding him accountable. I mean, even top-ranking Republicans are having enough of it. Michael McCall said, quote, "I think Russian propaganda has made its way into the United States. Unfortunately, it's infected a good chunk of my party's base," unquote. We just heard some of that right now. Republican Michael Turner, chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, quote, "We see directly coming from Russia attempts to mass communications that there are anti-Ukraine and pro-Russia messages, some of which we even hear being uttered on the House floor." Dr. Snyder, can you talk really quickly about some of the main narratives Russia uses when engaging in political warfare?
I appreciate this question because if we're going to talk about political warfare, we have to take into account the ways that countries cooperate. It's entirely artificial to say, here's China, here's America. That means that we leave aside Xinjiang, we leave aside Tibet, Hong Kong, Taiwan, New Zealand, Australia, Europe, all the places where China practices political warfare, and we leave aside Russia and Ukraine, which is where it matters the most. Political warfare is only political warfare if it passes through us. That is the intention. We've just seen an example of it passing through a person. It's only political warfare if it passes through us. What the Russians and the Chinese imitating the Russians try to do is to convince us that our system is no better than theirs, there's no point in voting, and we should support, if we support anyone at all, the person who's most likely to bring our system down. That's the point.
I really appreciate you bringing up the fact that it has to pass through us, because we just heard it here from my colleague, and here's another tweet from the same colleague saying, "Anyone who votes to fund Ukraine is funding the most corrupt money scheme of any foreign war in our country's history." And if you look at where this is from the Strategic Culture Foundation, an online journal run by a Russian intelligence service that has been sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury Department for election interference. So we see it passing through us, and not just with the colleague that just spoke, but with many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. And what Russian propaganda won't tell you is most of the money allocated for Ukraine is actually spent in America. 90% of it going to Americans. And so are these American companies that support Ukraine, are these allegations based on evidence, Dr. Snyder? And if not, where do these allegations against President Zelensky and his cabinet come from?
First of all, U.S. weapons are being used extremely efficiently on the Ukrainian battlefield. They're being audited in practice. Secondly, there is an American institution which does audit the way that is expended. Third of all, you're quite right. What the allocation of usually weapons that are about to be decommissioned anyway to Ukraine means is that we spend more on modern weapons inside the United States, which is why the defense industry is generally in favor of it. This trope of Ukraine being corrupt with respect to the weapons comes from a handful of Russian sources. There is no reason to think it. They're fighting for their lives. They're doing very well.
Yeah, thank you so much. We've got to let that sink in. We have members of the United States Congress